Sunday, November the 4th, 1979. With Iran in the grip of a political revolution, a group of students stormed the United States Embassy in the capital, Tehran. They rounded up the Americans inside and took them hostage. What the Iranians did not know was that 6 Americans had managed to avoid capture and were hiding in the homes of Canadian embassy staff. This is the story of how the CIA helped them escape.
It was a very high-level request. The president was directly involved. That's what made this operation quite different, is in fact the president himself made the final decision for me to launch into Tehran.
The operation became an elaborate scheme involving fake IDs, a bogus Hollywood movie, and unprecedented cooperation between 2 nations. The facts surrounding this escape have been kept secret for nearly 20 years. Now, with access to the classified files of the CIA, the true story behind the agency's involvement in this rescue operation can be revealed. November the 4th, 1979, the beginning of a foreign policy nightmare for the United States. Iranian fundamentalist students stormed the American embassy compound in Tehran, grabbing 53 American hostages. But within the 27-acre perimeter of the compound lay another building, the American consular section. As the main chancellery was being overtaken, the Americans in the consular building saw what was happening, but for some reason, their side was not under immediate attack. Among those working that morning were Cora and Mark Lyjak.
A group of us headed off to the British Embassy, which required us to turn left as we exited the building. The other Americans decided to go to the house of the Consul General and play bridge, and so they went straight. And that was the difference for us. Making that left took us a different route. They went straight out the back. Before long, they were back with the other hostages.
Later, a memo from the State Department to the CIA revealed that 6 diplomats had managed to escape the roundup. They had sought sanctuary in the Canadian embassy and were now being held in a safe house. In spite of efforts to keep this information confidential, there were calls to the Canadian embassy in Tehran asking for the 6 people by name. Canadian Ambassador Ken Taylor could do nothing but deny knowledge of the 6.
Certainly their embassy was at risk. So what the Canadians are doing is very quickly figuring out how to minimize their risk, and their risk being the number of people that they have in Tehran. They're drawing down on their embassy. They're starting to send people home rather quietly.
2 of the Americans were now hiding in Ambassador Taylor's house. Mark Lyjak, his wife, and the other 2 ended up at the residence of Canadian First Officer John Sherdown. As events unfolded, they quickly became aware of how dangerous their situation had become.
It's my recollection we only had one plan put to us, and this was if and when the hostages were released, we would be escorted to the airport by a group of Western ambassadors and then kind of turned over to the Iranians saying, since you're letting the others go, why don't you take these 6 too? Now, we didn't think much of that plan, but that was the only one we knew about.
The State Department knew that if the Iranian revolutionaries found out about the 6 Americans, they would stop at nothing to track them down. They turned to the CIA to help plan an escape. The CIA turned to their Department of Technical Service, a highly specialized and top-secret division within the agency.
We're responding to requests that come to us from the various divisions and centers. We're also developing new techniques, new capabilities, new tools. They like to say that they make cool things for spying, and it's a fact. That's what they are all about.
Tony Mendez was an experienced technical operations officer at the CIA. His particular speciality was forgery and disguise.
Only when it became clear that at least one member of the media had the information did we realize it was a case of either making the rescue of the 6 before hostile pursuit or after. Obviously, with hostile pursuit with 6 people, that would be very difficult. So we decided we better move quickly.
Ambassador, that's great.
Through diplomatic channels in the Canadian capital, Ottawa, Tony Mendez began communicating with Ambassador Taylor in Iran. For the operation, Mendez joined with fellow CIA officer Julio.
Julio is an OTS officer. It's the name that I've assigned him. When you do an exfiltration, you have 2 guys that are technical operations officer, one who can bring to bear those artistic things, which was my part of it, you know, the forgery and the disguise and so forth. His part of it was the analytical and language, and he had Farsi, which was the language, the operative language in the country. He could also carry fluent French, Spanish, Russian. I mean, he could be anybody.
Together, they assembled a small team of specialists to decide what disguises they would use and the documents they would need.
And we started putting together the essential elements of an operation like this. What kind of documents are we going to use? What kind of nationality are they going to be? What kind of cover are they going to have? What we very quickly realized is we weren't going to use some foreign document because we weren't really sure that these people could carry a foreign persona.
The problem Tony had in creating a plan is, how do you take 6 diplomats that are not trained intelligence officers, and what type of cover and legend could you create that they could effectively live without extensive training? Well, obviously they can't be Americans, because Americans are the hated infidels. But no one was mad at the Canadians, and the Canadian mannerisms and languages are so close, that was the normal conclusion.
The CIA decided the most reliable option was to rescue the 6 from Iran using Canadian passports. But getting the Canadian government to agree to this plan was just the first of many problems Mendez and his team would have to solve.
It's a busy crime night tomorrow on Discovery, starting at 9 with the forensic detectives exploring the use of scent to track killers. Later at 10 in the FBI files, a millionaire's daughter is kidnapped. Can the bloodshed be avoided? And at 11, when a 2-year-old is found dead, it takes the girl's family to bring the killer to justice in The Prosecutors. Thursday on Discovery.
Beyond fear. Beyond limitations. Beyond adversity. Beyond the call of duty.
These men risk their lives every day, saying goodbye to their families with a good chance they will not come home.
Beyond tough, part of Reality Night. Friday at 9 on Discovery.
Someone will always need their street to be swept. I've been doing this job for 9 years, and I've seen so much in 9 years. You put your bag of rubbish out and you just forget it, and it's gone when you come back. But when you come to the other side, then you see how that bag of rubbish has been picked up, how it's carried out, how much effort through the full process. There is a lot of specialist equipment. We've got the hand barrows, that'd be your start, and then we've got rascals. I mean, we have such a variety. The guy on the street doing the work is the important guy. He's the one that the public see. He's the one that the public perceive as carrying out the work. What you tend to find is with the guys is that they're characters. I mean, you've got some fantastic characters out there. I can point out a sweeper. He's took his barrow into work. He's painted it. He cleans it every day. He keeps his street spotless, and he's proud of that barrow. You can't replace characters like that. You know, once those characters are gone, they're the ones that make the game. You can go up to 99% of sweepers and say, excuse me, could you just sweep down the front of that? And they do it. That's the way they are. It's a part of you. It's a part of your life, part of the way you live. Sometimes it's 150 miles an hour, and at the best times it's only 100 miles an hour.
Would Canada issue passports to the 6 Americans?
But we weren't too sure that the Canadians were going to break their own passport law and issue us passports for this kind of operation, because obviously the blowback potential was enormous. And we were really quite surprised that they very quickly had a secret session of Parliament, first secret session since World War II, and passed an exception to their passport law just for this purpose. When we asked them if we could have 12 instead of 6, that way giving us a redundant capability, they said fine. Then I said, and maybe a couple more, one for me and my fellow officer, and they said, no, none for you guys. These are only for refugees. So we had to provide our own, which we were perfectly able to do.
The CIA collected from around the world, beginning in World War II, virtually an exemplar of every travel document that was produced and used anywhere in the world. So if you needed to recreate a passport that was in use in Lebanon in 1985, the CIA would have an example, and they would have the technical expertise to do that.
The CIA still had to come up with a convincing reason for the 6 people being in Tehran in the first place. They also had to find a way for them to leave without arousing suspicion. And movement in and out of the country was tightly controlled by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Mendes and his team needed a solid cover story. The Canadian government and the United States State Department offered a number of possibilities.
Well, what do you got? We came up with nutritionists.
Along with nutritionists studying crops, Mendes also considered the idea of packaging the Americans as a group of international school teachers.
Both of these were not really great for this period of time. And in the case of people studying the crops, this was the middle of winter, and in this part of Iran, there's a lot of snow, so it's kind of hard to inspect the crops. But that was the kind of thing we were knocking about.
Mendes was about to leave for another of the many trips he was now taking to Ottawa when an idea came to him. The type of people who would go to a place like Iran, regardless of the political situation, might be Hollywood filmmakers. Their main job would be scouting film locations.
They would be so focused on their need to shoot a particular scene in a particular bazaar or find the right hill or whatever that they wouldn't mind going there and just showing up.
Listen, I might need your help pulling something together.
As soon as he got to his hotel in Ottawa, Mendes was on the phone to a contact in California.
I have this idea. How many people would be in a location scouting party?
He discovered that a location scouting party would typically consist of 6 to 8 people.
And I said, perfect. What would their titles be? So I got each job description.
The following day, he pitched the idea to the Canadians. They agreed it was plausible and had no problems associated with timing. It seemed like a perfect fit. In fact, the idea was even better than Mendes had imagined. The Iranians were doing everything possible to show that their country was stable. They were even trying to promote tourism. A Western film crew shooting a movie would help to improve Iran's international image. And coming at a time when its foreign assets were frozen, the Iranian government would more than welcome the hard currency. Mendes started fleshing out his plan. The success of the operation and the lives of the 6 Americans would depend on minute attention to detail.
Certain people in certain classes of individuals carry certain things, and they did a study. So if you are a doctor or a graduate of a university, you are most likely to carry certain things in your wallet. And they call this pocket litter. It's the type of things that make your disguise believable. It's a couple of movie stubs from the movie last weekend. It's a receipt when you went to dinner in the city where you're supposed to be living. It's a note to attend your college reunion next year. But everything builds to create the legend.
In order to start fleshing out an idea, you very quickly have to do a lot of things, and many of them are logistical. But in this case, I wanted to create a backstopping, as we would call it, for the cover.
Mendes drew $10,000 from CIA funds and got on a plane to Los Angeles. He phoned ahead to get his Hollywood contacts to start calling in favors. The first thing he needed to do was to establish a film production office. By the time he landed, he had found they'd already located a high-profile suite of offices at the old Columbia Studios lot in Hollywood.
So it was Friday, and they started making phone calls, getting the phones hooked up. It was supposed to take a week, and they were getting it done over the weekend. So by Tuesday, we were set up.
They'd furnished the offices right down to paper clips and staffed them with family members of Mendes's local contacts. Studio 6 Productions had been born. From a pile of scripts lying around the studio, Mendes and his team chose a science fiction story that adapted well to a Middle Eastern location. The name of the new movie would be Argo. To further legitimize Studio 6 Productions, Mendes went as far as taking out full-page advertisements in the local Hollywood trade magazines, Variety and The Hollywood Reporter.
You have to instill confidence in them, and if they know that you went to the trouble of going to Hollywood and taking out a full-page ad with their name on it, that's going to go a long way. They're going to buy into it very quickly.
They had to create layer after layer after layer of deception. Most of it would probably never be checked, but it was all necessary in case the one Iranian decided at the embassy, is this a legitimate company? Do I need to call and check?
With their Hollywood presence firmly established, it was time for Mendes to turn his attention to the bigger picture, transforming the identities of the 6 Americans trapped in Iran. Although they were staying in 2 different residences, they would get together occasionally for dinner. They did their best to keep their spirits up, but they were all too aware of the dangers that lay ahead.
They'd get all together. They played a lot of Scrabble and have big dinners and try to keep each other's spirits up. They became very good gourmet chefs because they had a great place to do this in the Shirdown residence, because it had a huge kitchen, almost like a commercial kitchen, and they entertained themselves that way.
I was very fortunate to be there. It became harder as the months passed, and we began to say, hey, we need to, figure out some way to get out of here.
Mendes was doing just that back in the United States. He began to create identities for the 6 Americans in their new roles as Hollywood movie makers. Each would require a separate specific job title, such as location manager, set designer, and cameraman. Thanks to the swift action of the Canadian Parliament, they would be traveling out of Iran as Canadian citizens. But the existence of a passport was not nearly enough. Each one had to contain the right travel visas and supporting documents. To do this effectively, the CIA officers routinely travel around the world to have visas stamped into their passports. During an emergency such as this, the visa stamps are studied and, if necessary, forged.
We had to get a visa issued in the country that they would have gotten theirs, which would in this case be Canada. So we had to get somebody outfitted up to go out and collect this visa, a Canadian in a Canadian passport in Ottawa from the Iranian embassy, and then you take that as your exemplar and you make the 6.
Every passport tells a story, and the Americans would need their Canadian passports to give a plausible explanation as to how they arrived in Tehran.
If you come into a country illicitly or illegally, well, they're not going to let you leave unless you can show that you legitimately arrived. So upon occasion during the Cold War, it was necessary to create different stamps or the rubber chop marks that were put on in passport control. This is an example of a real one from the Calcutta Police Passport Control. And Tony Mendes operationally was forced to duplicate that. And one of the steps he did was to actually trace it with a heavy number 2 lead pencil onto small tracing paper. It was then superimposed on the document in question. And after stippling it in place and taking a toothpick dipped into the standard color ink pad in use by the organization, he would trace and actually dot and make the impression marks over each letter exactly to the pattern that he had traced. The result was this exact copy, which was then countersigned. For a trained professional such as Tony Mendez, this entire operation could be done in less than 15 minutes.
Mendez would imprint each of the newly obtained Canadian passports with a series of visas and stamps. This would give the appearance that the 6 Americans posing as film scouts had a history of traveling.
You got to build a timeline. When you look at the passport, you have to look at the visa and say, well, yeah, that was issued after the passport was issued. So when we had the passports issued, we had them backdated so they'd fit our story.
In addition, each individual would require all the usual credit cards, driver's licenses, and other assorted documents that they would normally carry.
We're getting into some of the fine-grained detail, but it's a very complicated piece of business to collect all this intelligence worldwide and then know how to package it so that an analyst on their side couldn't sit there and take it apart just by the literal data.
Eventually, Mendez would assemble an entire portfolio containing complete dossiers on each individual. The 6 Americans would have to memorize every detail of these new identities.
It's a lot more than just, 1 or 2 items. You end up with many people involved. Certainly our whole graphics capability, the artists designing things. I had storyboards made. Each one of the people had props like that.
Mendez and his CIA partner also had to get real Iranian visas for themselves.
The easiest thing for them to check is your visa, because all I got to do is pick up the phone and call the city in the world where you acquired that visa and say, do you have a file on this guy?
To get his, Julio traveled to Geneva, Switzerland, while Mendez flew to Bonn in Germany.
We always have a fallback, as we say. In my case, I had another officer in Paris go with the same name in the same kind of document into another Iranian embassy and acquire one at the same time. And that was redundancy, if you follow me. In other words, if I wasn't able to get it in Bonn for one reason and this guy was able to get his, then I would very quickly reproduce his with all the right markings and everything and assume his identity.
But in spite of all his ingenuity, there was one thing that even Mendez couldn't fake: the embarkation-disembarkation form the Americans would need to leave Iran. 2 identical slips, one white, the other yellow. On entry into the country, the immigration officer would sign and stamp both copies, retaining the white. Visitors were required to give back the yellow copy on departure. In theory, the 2 would be matched up before the traveler was allowed to leave the country.
That was what I call the operative document, the one thing that could catch you up. You can make everything perfect, and you can make a plan to backstop as much as you possibly can, but the one thing that we couldn't control was the embarkation-disembarkation form.
Even though Mendez had forged the yellow disembarkation forms, the problem lay in the fact that Iranian immigration would have no white slip record of the 6 entering Iran in their assumed roles as Canadian filmmakers. Except for police states, countries using this system seldom bothered to match up the 2 slips. It was an acceptable risk.
Driver's license, resume.
With real Iranian visas for himself and his partner and everything checked out, Mendez was ready.
We send a flash cable back to Washington and say, we're ready to go, we request permission to launch, and they come back and say, within 10 minutes, go. And so I got my stuff, I'm halfway out the door, and somebody comes running and says, stop. And they hand me a cable, and it says, stand down. The president is making a finding. And so the head of our unit there says, what does that mean? And I said, I think he's making the decision whether I'm going to go or not. He's asking his advisors if this makes sense.
There was a real debate on who should we send in for the disguise officer. Obviously, Tony was the best person, but the CIA took a risk. Here is a man that not only can do this operation, but he knows the intricacies and the methodology of all of the exfiltrations and infiltrations that the CIA could do. If he had been captured and tortured, it literally could have compromised CIA operations globally. But they said that the rescue of the 6 was worth it.
So in 20 minutes, I got another cable saying, your mission has been approved. Good luck.
With approval from the president, the elaborate undercover operation of CIA officer Tony Mendez was underway. His mission was to rescue 6 Americans from Tehran, disguised as a Hollywood movie production team. His ingenious plan was supported by the creation of an actual production company based in Los Angeles. The company was so real that word was already spreading about the new movie. With their background story in place, Mendez and his partner traveled to Iran to launch their mission. On their arrival in Tehran, they were greeted by Canadian Ambassador Ken Taylor and his associate, Roger Lucy.
We'd like to take this time to thank you.
They spent time discussing the details of the operation. Ken Taylor shared with them as much information as he knew about recent events in Tehran.
Okay, then.
When the meeting ended, Mendez and Julio were informed that the American hostages were preparing a gourmet meal to celebrate their arrival.
And they were fixing this 7-course meal, and they're getting into it, and everybody's kind of having a party. It was a party.
The Americans knew that U.S. officials were to meet them that night, but the 6 had no idea they were from the CIA.
Kevin?
Helium was found on the Sun before it was discovered on Earth. Did the impact crater on one side of Mercury really cause the ridges on the other? Jupiter is bigger than the other 8 planets put together, but Pluto is so small, could it really be a comet? Explore the worlds that share our Sun. The Planets, part of Science Night, Tuesday at 11 on Discovery.
You may fool the police. You may even be able to cheat a lie detector. But sometimes, a tiny drop of blood, a discarded cigarette butt, or a strain of hair tells what you won't. The truth. There is no escaping. Crime Night, tomorrow from 9 on Discovery.
Take a fresh perspective on what's real.
And what's unreal.
One person's dream is another's reality.
And someone else's nightmare.
It's real life.
But not necessarily as you know it.
Reality Night, Fridays at 9 on Discovery.
After getting to know the Americans, Mendez felt he was ready to discuss their escape options. He explained that they could leave the country undercover as international school teachers or nutritionists. But he gave his Hollywood movie crew idea the most positive spin. He presented that option last.
Cargo.
Mendez explained the details of the operation. The authentic Canadian passports, driver's licenses, credit cards, as well as the fictional personal and professional histories created for each of the Americans.
They had somebody back in Hollywood to answer the phone. There was already an ad for the movie in a Hollywood magazine. So most of us felt pretty good about it, that if they stopped us, there'd be enough backup that, you know, the story would hold.
Mendez then made the Americans aware of the problems concerning the discrepancy with the disembarkation forms.
But there was one member of their party who was more intellectual and worried a little bit more about the things like the disembarkation card. And he was saying, well, I'm not so sure the Iranians are not able to match these up, and they won't do that, and so forth and so on.
One of the most difficult areas that a CIA disguise expert must work in
is not the physical changes to the person, but it's changing the mindset. Because unless the person has confidence, the operation runs great risks of being uncovered.
Sensing doubts within the group, Mendes suggested they discuss their options in private.
Customs investigators are trained to look at people, to look in their eyes. Do they seem nervous? Does their picture match the passport? Is anything out of order? And the real pros develop a sixth sense. And when they see a person who falls out of the norm, then they give them extra scrutiny. So what the CIA had to do was not only create the best disguises, but they had to make the people believe that they would be successful.
About 15 minutes later, Mendes interrupted them.
And I said, listen, let me just show you how you do this kind of operation. I took out 2 corks. I said, okay, here's the way it works. Here's the bad guys, and here's you guys, and then we're going to go right through them as if we're invisible. So the paradigm is you're going like this and pulling them apart, but in fact, you're coming like this and going like that. And the way you do that is like this. What it did was give them a sense of what kind of person that they were dealing with here, somebody who thought in these kinds of ways and approached the problem in a kind of deceptive way.
Mendes gave the Americans the confidence they needed to go ahead with the plan. One by one, they agreed.
All right, let's do it.
The perfect operation is that you walk right through the teeth of the bad guys, right out the front door, and nobody knows it happened.
Despite their initial fears, Mendes had managed to gain the confidence of the 6 American hostages. This was crucial if the operation was to succeed. They now had less than 36 hours to learn their new identities. Mendes knew there was a lot of work ahead. He had convinced the 6 Americans to go along with his audacious rescue plan. The question now was whether they would actually pull off their individual roles. To do so, they would have to really become the Hollywood professionals as described in their new passports. The night had been a success, but the Americans were left with only 1 day to learn their new identities. The next day, Mendes and his partner worked through the final details. They completed forging documents, backstamping visas, and reconfirming the flight reservations.
6667.
We're sitting there doing our forgery thing, and he's sitting over in the corner on a couch having a ball, listening to us talk how we're going to do this and how we're going to do that. And one of the stamp pads, I recall, had dried out. You have to mix the right ink color for the right stamp or visa or whatever. So I went over to his liquor cabinet and got a bottle of scotch and poured some of his scotch on it. You know, you can see how you actually do things like that.
And in almost every operation, ultimately its success depends on the ability of the intelligence officer to react to the unpredicted. So Tony's knowledge was able to simply take the worn pad and using the scotch get enough alcohol to reconstitute it, and he was able then to get a legible image that on scrutiny would appear consistent with all of the other faded images that the guards saw each day. And that was critical in the escape.
By now, the 6 Americans were starting to develop and identify with their new characters. Joe Stafford was the banker, the money man. Mark Lyjak was the location transport coordinator. Cora Lyjak was the story consultant. Kathy Stafford was the set designer. And Lee Schatz was the cameraman. Even Bob Andrews, the ultra-conservative head of consular affairs, transformed himself into a flamboyant film director. In case any of them were challenged, they all tried to learn as much as possible about their new profession they had to be at least superficially convincing.
They gave us biographic information about ourselves, and so I think we just individually learned those. And in my case, it seemed like somebody had done some study, or it was coincidence, because my name was the name of somebody I went to high school with who shares my birthday. Mark's new birthday was my dad's birthday. And there were several things like that that made it very easy. If somebody had questioned me about Mark's birthday, my birth date, I could easily associate.
Even so, the unpredictable behavior of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards concerned Mendes. He needed to prepare the Americans for the possibility of an interrogation. It was decided that Canadian staff officer Roger Lucy, who spoke Farsi, would dress up as an Iranian militant and prepare them for what might lie ahead.
These guys could just do anything, and they were unpredictable. And that's why we would be more concerned about running into one of them as we were departing than going through the normal formalities with the regular customs and immigration guys.
We go off to meet them at Sheerdowns again on Sunday night, and now we see these transformed characters, you know, these Hollywood guys, and they're great, and they're having a ball. And the plan is to have Roger Lucy, the second officer in the Canadians, and be the interrogator. So he shows up in his camis with his swagger stick and his jack boots, and he's going to be the Iranian interrogator.
What is your name?
Lee Schatz, who was up for it, realized that he hadn't done his homework, and so he went off to do it and came back and did it again.
Remove your glasses, please.
Some of the Americans adapted well to their new identities.
Robert Lee Baker.
Others would soon learn that they were not as prepared as they needed to be.
Roger did a good job, as well as you could. He did ask the questions quickly, and he was trying to put us on the defensive, basically, to throw so much at you that you'd forget. And it worked. I mean, we did forget.
Surely you know the writers of your own movie that you are the story consultant on, don't you?
He did ask the questions quickly, so some of us did stumble on the answers, and I think it made us realize we needed to, study more.
It's one thing to effectively change a person's external appearance. That is often easier to do than to change the inside, your comportment, your sense of confidence, the way that you hold yourself, the way that you speak, the way that you look the person in the eye. And during the time of this revolutionary period, everyone was being subjected at the airport to a level of scrutiny that never would have existed in the pre-revolutionary moments. And it was one of the great fears they had to pull the operation off.
The fate of the other 53 hostages was unknown. The stability of the region was rapidly declining. The Americans were becoming aware that the escape, now only hours away, was more than just a game. Their ability to carry off this deception would result in eventual freedom or possible death.
We hold the government of Iran fully responsible for the well-being and the safe return of every single person.
On the morning of January the 28th, 1980, the 6 Americans prepared to go to Tehran International Airport, from where CIA officer Tony Mendes planned to send them back to America. Mendes had arranged with one of the Canadian diplomats to pick him up in front of his hotel at 3 in the morning. He wanted to check out the airport ahead of time. He knew that by 10 o'clock, the building would be busy. It was important to get the feel of everything while it was still quiet.
Morning, sir. Morning. I'd like to check if Flight 363 Swiss Air is arriving on time.
What worried people more than anything about this whole operation is the capricious nature of the Revolutionary Guard. These are the guys who were in the bush during the Shah's reign. These are the guys who were the bandits. These are the guys with the bandoliers, the guys you see in all the movies, They spent their nights shooting up the town, and trying to do whatever mischief they could, and that's what they did at the airport.
They were the ones who were really causing the trouble. They would interfere in the work of the regular customs and immigration people as they wanted to.
But everything appeared to be calm. The scheduled Swissair flight was already on its way to Tehran. Mendes took up his position at the pre-arranged spot where the Americans could see him and know it was safe to proceed. They went through customs, then checked in at the Swissair desk without a hitch. So far, so good. As they continued to the airline check-in, Lee Schatz moved ahead of the group. Next stop, immigration, the area that they had been warned could be the most dangerous. This is where they would hand in their yellow embarkation forms and hope the immigration officer wouldn't try to match them with the non-existent white copies.
Lee is 10 steps ahead of us. He's there, he's eager.
No, sir.
And the guy questioned him about his photo. His mustache was shorter.
You look different than this
and
picture.
Lee's, I cut it, the photograph.
You look different than
Immigration man went into the inner office.
I'll be back, okay?
We didn't know if he was checking to see if the white slip was there to match the yellow slip or not, so we were kind of hanging back and holding our breath a little bit. And so we had a little moment when we were sweating. We say, "What is he doing?"
And have a nice trip.
Thank you very much. He came out with a cup of tea. He just wanted to get a cup of tea.
Hi.
The rest of the Americans passed through immigration without any trouble. They continued to the departure lounge. They knew that here they would be especially vulnerable. They found a quiet corner where they sat down and tried to look as inconspicuous as possible. The Revolutionary Guards patrolling the area were known to conduct random interrogations. They could pounce at any time.
Stop, sir. What do you have in the bag?
The Revolutionary Guards, one of their concerns was that the riches that had been accumulated in their belief illegally under the Shah were now being stolen and taken out of the country. So they saw part of their patriotic duty was to stop this looting of the country and shipping its assets to the West.
Can you open the bag, sir? Take care of her.
They're there at the airport, they have no training, and they're totally unpredictable. This was the greatest fear that Tony had.
Shut up, you!
Adding to growing tension, Joe Stafford almost blew their cover when he inadvertently picked up a newspaper written in Farsi, a rather suspicious activity for a Canadian filmmaker. The tension was relentless, yet they had no choice but to sit and wait while other flights came and went. Finally, it was time for their flight to be called, but it wasn't. Not knowing what might have happened, they tried to stay calm and keep from imagining the worst. Suddenly, they heard an announcement.
May I have your attention, please? Swissair Flight 363 will be delayed 1 hour for routine maintenance. Your attention, please. Swissair Flight 363 departing for Zurich will be delayed for 1 hour. Thank you.
Well, I was really worried because when the airline says 30 minutes, it's usually 4 hours. And I thought, oh, if we're here for a long time, then somebody might discover us.
Was there really a mechanical failure? Or were the Iranian authorities onto them? On the brink of departure, with Revolutionary Guards hovering, the tension was unbearable. Mendes located the Canadian diplomat who drove him to the airport and asked if he could find out what was going on.
Did you hear that?
Yeah.
The flight's been delayed. Can we do something about it?
Had the Swissair flight really been delayed, or had the Iranians uncovered the Americans' secret?
I see things you'd never believe. I make them believable. I find you innovation and originality. I uncover how things work. The inspiration and invention from a revelation. I illuminate ideas and explore concepts and find new frontiers with endless possibilities. Where there are problems, I find opportunities. I find solutions in adversity and inspiration in the stories I have to tell. What am I? I'm a discovery. You can share my imagination.
Share your planet. Animal Planet.
When the most advanced engineering technology meets art and innovative design, the results can be just amazing. Superstructures, part of Science Night, Tuesday at 10 on Discovery.
With the 6 Americans waiting nervously in the departure lounge, Mendes tried to discover if the delay to their flight was real or some sort of stalling tactic engineered by the Iranians.
I'll check the mechanical problem. Thank you.
Much to his relief, the word came back that the mechanical problem was genuine. Swissair expected it to be fixed within the hour.
Tony actually had tickets for us on another flight as well, and the bus had just left for that flight. And I remember we went up to him to decide what to do, and he said, you know, it would look too odd if we suddenly whipped out our other tickets and said, oh, we have tickets for this other plane.
Finally, after an hour that felt like an eternity, their flight was called.
We're walking up the ramp to the Swissair flights, and Bob Anders jabs me in the ribs, and he says, you guys think of everything. And he pointed to the nose of the airplane and painted across the nose of the airplane of the word Aargau, which is very close to Argo, obviously, the name of a city in Switzerland. So that was the omen. You know, in every operation you have a moment when you say it's going to be okay.
The plane took off. They would not be in the clear until officially out of Iranian airspace.
Once we are wheels up and we're flying out of the airspace, we do a thumbs up and smiles all around and order some Bloody Marys and toast the flight.
Cheers! As we left, each step got us closer to freedom, being liberated, and so getting on the plane got us closer, and then when we got out of Iranian airspace, I felt better, and then eventually when we landed in Europe, you know, we were basically scot-free, and we were out.
I say to the group, everyone here, when this is over, is going to want to write a book don't do it. Julio and I need to stay in business because we do this sort of thing all the time. And no one did. So we arrive in Zurich in a couple hours, and as we come down the ramp to the tarmac there, a couple of them drop down and kiss the tarmac, which was rather curious from some of the passengers' point of view, I guess. And Julio and I bring them into the airport, and we see the State Department people there to meet them, and we hand them over, and they whisk them off to some safe site in Zurich. Just leave us standing there. They don't say, hello, how are you? What are you guys going to do? Or anything. We're just sort of left there, and so we go to lunch and catch our flight to Frankfurt. And it's kind of like a routine day at the office, you know.
Days later, the media broke the story of the escape, prompting an outpouring of gratitude from the American public. Ambassador Ken Taylor was credited for smuggling the Americans out, and for that, he became an instant celebrity. Taylor took the credit for the escape to keep the world from discovering the CIA's involvement.
The Canadian ambassador was largely celebrated and has gone on to fame and fortune. In fact, he's a U.S. citizen now. He got a gold medal from U.S. Congress presented by Reagan. And I don't think Reagan ever knew the story.
You mentioned about getting passports, but you didn't mention anything about exit visas. Could you tell us how those were falsified or what you did about that?
Well, I got the passports. And I think the rest is what you'd call a trade secret.
The CIA instructed him to play out his cover, maintain this image that they created, and he did it. And it was only when the CIA finally broke the story that he admitted the truth. So he was a loyal soldier, he did his job, and many lives were saved because of that.
444 days after the ordeal started, the 53 hostages were finally released, ending a fearful chapter in American history. Among those standing on the White House lawn during the greeting ceremony with President Reagan were the 6 Americans. With the Americans safely back on home ground, Mendes dismantled Studio 6. During its short life, the studio had actually been pitched over 20 genuine scripts by major Hollywood producers. None of them would ever know it, but they had missed the best story of all.
Head back to the era of the Second World War next on Discovery to learn more about the air battles over Russia that were crucial in the defeat of German soldiers on the ground. That's in Air Wars next.